This year's College of Humanities honored alumni is Marguerite Gong Hancock, who for more than 2 decades has had a front row seat observing the emergence of technical innovations that have changed our lives. Marguerite is passionate about innovation and entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley and high-tech hubs around the world. She is focused on advancing knowledge, creating educational resources, and convening thought leaders to empower communities of innovators and entrepreneurs, an important theme. She earned her BA from the College of Humanities in Humanities and Asian Studies in 1982, and then earned an MA from Harvard. She is married to Russell Hancock, and they are the parents of 3 children. She has other friends and guests here today, and I'd like you to stand if you're a friend or guest so that we can all acknowledge your presence, or at least raise your hand. Let's see, just raise your hand if you see this. She has a real fan club here at BYU. Thank you. Marguerite worked for 20 years at Stanford, where she led programs in innovation and entrepreneurship. She has co-edited 3 books covering the Silicon Valley Edge, Innovation in China, and Comparative University Industry Ties in the U.S. and China. She has also served as an advisor to ministry-level leaders from Taiwan to Spain on how government can support innovative companies and sustain high-tech regions. She's the founding executive director of a new center on global innovation and entrepreneurship at the Computer History Museum, which has been called Silicon Valley's answer to the Smithsonian. On the concept of alumni, I have to say something that I've learned today as a new dean, having the chance to greet her and host her today, and that is, I haven't thought much about alumni being a professor here, but when I ran into one of my fellow classmates as the honored alumni, I realized there is something wonderful about your experiences. So to you students who are here today, I just want to say, you will someday be alumni. You may not imagine that now, but when you are, you'll have this marvelous experience of not only reflecting back on great memories and moments at BYU, but you'll often run into some of these people. And when you do, it's a wonderful experience to have reignited again those feelings of friendship and even passion about the subject that you studied together. In our case, Marguerite and I were in a Scandinavian literature class together. Both of us were getting close to graduation. Grades were somewhat on our mind, and the teacher was a visiting faculty member. And she tried a new and innovative way of grading essay exams being very objective about it. And as I remember, I think every single person in the class failed the exam. And for most of us, that was not something we'd experienced at BYU. I brought along a text of the classes. It was Ibsen and Strindberg that we were looking at. And when Marguerite saw this in my office today, she said she has the same book in her office. So in spite of that sort of negative experience, we both kept our textbooks. I do want to say, though, that something interesting, this teacher tried innovation in how she graded the exams. As a result, we all sort of crowdsourced, talked about what we were going to do. We went to her and talked to her about it. We laid out our arguments. We used entrepreneurship in our efforts to try to get her to change the grade. I think eventually it got to the dean's office and we all passed the class. So I think early on she was destined to study innovation and entrepreneurship, at least based on my experience with her here at BYU. In a recent interview for the college magazine, Marguerite noted the following factoids, which I will share with you. Her most worn book, The Scriptures. The pinch yourself moment was becoming a mom. Her splurge is having adventures together with her family. And a favorite scripture includes the following verse. And above all things, clothe yourselves with the bond of charity as with a mantle, which is the bond of perfectness and peace. I think we're going to sense Marguerite's charity today in her presentation. When asked how she practices the humanities for this article, she replied, by asking big questions and having the tools to explore. Today, we'll learn about some of those tools from Sister Marguerite Gong Hancock. Marguerite.
Oh, what an honor. Truly an honor to be here and to be honored by the College of Humanities, by a colleague and classmate from back in our Ibsen days. Part of innovation and entrepreneurship is being willing to fail, and we came very close to it that year. Thank you. How do questions shape our lives? In his 3 questions, Leo Tolstoy tells a story. It once occurred to a king that if only he could find the answer to 3 questions, he could never fail. Who is the most important person that I should spend time with? What is the time that I should act? And what is the most important thing that will govern my actions? With these questions, he searched, and he made an announcement that if anybody could answer his questions, that they would be handsomely rewarded with much of the kingdom's treasures. People came to him and said, well, in terms of knowing when to act, maybe you could make a detailed plan of the days, months, and years and plan out exactly what needed to happen. Another wise man said, no, you cannot know in advance what the important decisions are, so you need to have a council. You must have me lead and convene your wise council. Somebody else said, those council people do not have enough in them. You need some magic, some magicians. Well, of course, nobody agreed on how these questions could be answered. And so the king said, none of you have satisfied my questions. I'm going to go visit the hermit in the wilderness. I have heard that he has the answer for real wisdom. He went and found the hermit digging in the garden. And he didn't really acknowledge. The king said, I've come with my questions. I am the king. And he just kept digging. The digging continued. King decided, well, I'll just dig alongside with him. Not much time followed, and a person stumbled out of the woods. He was bleeding profusely. The king rushed to his side and started to hold and bind the wound. And then Till came inside, and the hermit said, you've answered your 3 questions. You found out that the most important person is the person who's with you. The time to act is now because you have no control of the future. And the most important thing to do is to do good to that person who's with you now. What are the questions that govern our lives? In this case, the king asked 3 questions, and you notice that Tolstoy didn't call that story the 3 answers. He said they were the 3 questions. Whether you agree with those answers or not, questions determine what we look at, how we perceive the world, how we interpret it, what we know, what we do, and who we become. And yet, what are the questions that are governing our lives? What was the last question that you typed into the search bar for Google? What was the last question for you iPhone users that you asked Siri? When you woke up this morning, did you ask a question of somebody you were with? I'd like to suggest that we live in a time when there are so many answers and so much information available that it's not the answers that are increasing in value, it's the questions. Here's a question. Siri, what is the meaning of life? To think about questions like this. For those of you who use Siri, if you were to type that in again or ask Siri that again, another answer, and I asked this recently, Siri answered, try and be nice to people. Avoid eating fat. Read a good book now and then, get some walking in, and try to live together in peace and harmony with people of all creeds and nations. Not bad, right? These questions that we ask are a part of people around the world. This is a map that shows the graph of people asking questions in different languages on Google. How many questions are being asked a day? 100 billion. That's 2.2 million per minute. 100 billion searches per month. How does Google work? Well, Larry Page and Sergey Brin were Stanford students. They met, didn't really like each other. They argued about how they were going to ask the most important questions that they were thinking about in computer science. But together, as they became office mates, they realized that there could be kind of a strategy for thinking about how to make sense, how to rank information. They called it back rub, meaning that if you could reach back and see how others were referring to the information, that could be a good way to rank the relevance or answers to different people's questions. That's now, of course, called PageRank. So Google has a sort of a basic three-step process, right? First, they search and crawl through all the information that's available. 60 trillion pages and counting on the internet. And then use algorithms, about 200 currently right now, 200 kinds of questions and algorithms to be able to say, is this page more relevant, has been used by a more authoritative source, has it been referred to, and so forth. So then they rank it and then see about its relevance for you. Over time, of course, Google has indexed and made available through search people's answers to people's questions, not only through text, but also images and video. In the sea of information, the amazing thing is that Google's so smart now that how many times has this happened to you that when you type in your question, it starts to fill it out even before you've finished? On the one hand, that's an amazing thing that our technologists are moving forward. On the other hand, I'd like to suggest that maybe we are squandering our opportunity, that our questions are so small, they're so rote, they're so explicit, they're so direct, that even Google can guess what we're going to ask. Are we using the information and the tools that are available to us to ask the beautiful questions? Of course, the tools are changing. We have not only Google search, but changes in cognitive computing, where Picasso, who said computers are useless, they only give answers. But what beautiful answers they can give now. Cognitive computing combines machine learning now and ability to use natural language so that we can ask, not through having to use a software program, but somebody like me could ask the question, given the weather patterns and the economy, what would be the right kind of rice to plant when for my crop in India? Are we using these tools? Watson, who we saw, IBM's Watson, compete on Jeopardy, and who won, right? Watson is now being used for suggesting to doctors, given a patient's particular profile, their genetics, their treatment to date, their response to medication, what would be next. This ability to both predict and prescribe is a power of the technology that we have at hand. I wish I knew all the answers, one aunt says to the other. Big deal. You should try coming up with all the questions. So I ask again, are questions rising in relative value? Our answers are declining. Are we using the tools that we have to ask the most important questions? I'd like to tell a story, a family story, a very personal story actually, about how somebody in our family asked some beautiful, big questions and used the tools, in this case of Google and online information, to find some answers that have profoundly changed our family's life. So Loy Kway Char was a great-grandfather. He was with his family in Hawaii and would make frequent trips back to China, where they had immigrated from. He, over time, actually married another woman in China and started a family. My great-grandmother, a strong woman that she must have been, decided deceit was unacceptable and told him, you can go back to China to your family there and don't come back. So this was a sad situation for our family, but the family became ripped into two parts. And over time, we lost track. Who was this person? Where did he go? What has happened to that family? Well, several years ago, my niece and nephew, who were living in China at the time, Carl Brinton and Gloria Jean Gong, who are also graduates of BYU, thought, what would it be like if we could search for Loy Kway Char? Would we be able to find him? What about his children and grandchildren? Where are they now, and could we perhaps find a way to bring our families back together again? Carl says he began that search as the way that all searches begin, using Google. He typed in, using the genealogy that I had received from my uncle, the information that we had about where he might have been, this Loy Kway Char, what locations he might have been. There were about 80 different places across China in the area, which is now Shenzhen, a home to 10 million people. This was not going to be an easy task. He then used website Mandarin tools to then narrow it down using some other interviews that we had from our great uncle. Which pronunciations could match the romanizations in Cantonese at that time? Our great uncle, Washington, had remembered being a young child in the 20s and going with his father, who had been a government official in Hawaii, to go back to the village. I remember, he said, I remember going to Hong Kong and getting on a train. I remember the train going through the rice fields. I remember the rice fields going on, and then the train stopped. It wasn't even at a station, but the train stopped, and it was a big deal because he said, the train never stops anywhere except for at the station. But because you are honored guests and a government official from America, we're going to stop the train here. People came from the village and brought out a sedan chair and brought these two, father and son, back to the village as honored guests. Well, those were more clues. How many of these locations were within a 1 day's walking distance, close to the railroad, by a rice field? That narrowed it down to 16. They're getting closer. Their questions began to become more detailed. They narrowed it down to a particular area to search. And yet this is now a teeming area of 10 million people. The search led to the Australian National Archives, not on page 1, 2, 3, 4, but on page 7 or 8. They found these site for the Australian National Archives, and there was a 19th century Italian missionary who had made a map that had the locations, the pronunciation of the time, and it connected with the railway. Well, you can see how this story is going to end. The great news is that they then used Google Satellite to zero in to now they were down to 8 locations. And of those locations, they could see that there were all these factory buildings and just two little clusters of buildings where the original kind of village roofs, these gray buildings with tile roofs were. So they went and they met the people and said, we're searching for a family member, Loy Kwei Char, who is here, and here's his picture. Oh, nobody here were like that. He's too skinny. We had a story like that in our family, but he didn't look like that. Then they began to tell the story, but his family came once. They rode the train, and then she remembered, my father told the story. The train stopped, Carl and Gloria said, and the sedan chair came, and then she continued, and we carried him back to the village. What a happy reunion. What a remarkable thing for somebody in our family who asked big questions. What would it be like to search out a family member who had been shamed and shunned? What would it be like for us to use the technology and language skills to reunite a family? What would it be like to reunite generations over time? So with unprecedented tools, we have this capacity, if we're asking powerful questions. In this case, it was the question of a family and a question of searching for people. But we have this capacity to ask important questions. Are we asking the most beautiful, the most important, the ones that are going to have the most enduring impact for us and generations to come? Are those the kind of questions that are in our mind? You know The Little Prince. He told us about questions. He said, grown-ups like numbers. When you tell them about a new friend, they never ask questions about what really matters. They never ask, what does his voice like? Does he like butterflies? What games does he like to play? Adults ask questions like, how old is he? How many brothers does he have? How much money does his dad make? Only then do they think they know him. This inquisition of humans this inquisitive nature of humans is fundamental to who we are, and it sets us apart. This capacity to question, it of course is evident in children. Those who have been parents or been around 4-year-olds, why? 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 Sadly, I think over time, we lose patience with them and we start to think, let's not just ask why, let's get on to the doing. Or sometimes in school, we focus on teaching children about answers instead of questions. One well-known Nobel physicist said, my mother taught me to be a scientist because she didn't ask, what did you learn at school today? She said, what good question did you ask? My challenge is for us to think about audacious questions. His theory of relativity came from his work when he said, what would it be like if I rode a beam of light? Ray Kroc, as a salesman, why can't I get a good hamburger when I'm on the road? Coach in Florida, even though my players are playing hard in hot weather, how come they're not urinating more frequently? That was the birth of Gatorade, right? Well, when I was here at BYU, I had the opportunity from mentors, from friends, to ask questions. And I'd like to pay tribute to some of those people who contributed to those experiences that I had. To my mother, who as a young girl wanted to know the answer to the question, how does God communicate with his children? That led her to the church and then to an education here at BYU. To the DeYoung family, many who are here, a sister who said, when meeting my mom and heard that she was coming to BYU, you're going to the BYU? Why don't you live in my room? You could be with my family. 3 generations later, the Gong family is still in gratitude for the DeYoung family for the way that they asked and answered that question. To my freshman roommate, whose family is here, we tried to live that motto 24/7. For the first time in our lives when we were away from home, what does it mean to enter to learn and go forth to serve? To Professor Britch, who asked again and again, how do ideas from one person or one place or one era impact ideas and people in another place? To Professor Norton, who taught me English, how do we hone language to become a tool to enlighten and delight? And to Professor Heyer, who introduced me at the time to being interested in questions about China and change. What happened to the Chinese economy? Why didn't it industrialize? With people who have an understanding about China, why is it that there is not a deeper understanding about China here in the United States? With that kind of inspiration, as a young student, I applied to the National Endowment for Humanities and received a grant, kind of a big grant, actually, one of the biggest grants for the university at the time for student-led. We started the first program for teaching about Asia in schools, a little band of returned missionaries led by our mentor, Professor Heyer, who I'd like to recognize, who's here today. It was my first experience with asking these questions, not only why, but what if? What if we could help teach not just adults, but students, young kids who are learning for the first time about the world? What if we could teach them about Asia, this place that was not a part of the school curriculum? What if we could use this amazing group of missionaries who had been to Korea, Japan, all around Asia, and could help teach? What if we could build curriculum units? What if these curriculum units could then become teacher training, and within a few years, we had taught thousands of students and trained hundreds of teachers? And I think that program is still continuing. I will always be grateful for these people who helped me understand important questions and then turn the questions not only to questions of knowledge, but into action. What if we could make the world better? That impact has been fundamental to me as well as to our children. Now, all 3 of our children and our son-in-law have all been blessed by coming here to BYU. I had the fortune to be at Stanford, and the key question that led me there and that I have been asking is, what enables people who have a new idea, whether it's for technology or a new business model, what enables them to create a new product, a new business, a new organization that can then be translated to the market and impact people's lives? More broadly, what enables a place like Silicon Valley, where you have not just one person or one company, but a whole constellation of people who are pioneering? What enables a place like that to create and recreate its leading edge, from semiconductors to personal computers to the internet to mobile, social, and cloud today? What about other regions in the world who have their own assets, their own people, their own abilities? Is it possible to learn their own recipes of success, to grow? What about places that are declining? So these have been interesting questions that I've been doing work on, and these are some of the areas of some of the publications that we've been worked on. Some of my most interesting conversations have been with people of places that return to my roots here of the original questions at BYU. In China, how does an economy that has more than 1 billion people unleash the entrepreneurial spirit so that there can be change? Companies like Alibaba, who have now become global leaders, are not just using technology, but really pioneering new business models that are now beginning to impact and reverse the flow that first went from Silicon Valley to China and is now going from China back to Silicon Valley and around the world. Now I'm at the Computer History Museum, and we're starting something new. I'm an entrepreneur of a new startup in an institution that is dedicated and has the largest collection of computing. And there we're beginning a new center. Actually, there's no place in the world that has a collection that's documented entrepreneurship. So that's what we're beginning. We have the first Google server. You can see here the bootstrapping. Larry and Sergey didn't know what they were doing. They went off the rack and they got all this equipment. They stacked it up, but it got so hot when they turned it on, it started to melt. It started to melt the metal, started to bend. They put in cork to protect it. Artifacts in history have important legacy and lessons for us to understand. So we're starting to collect things. One of the most important things in our collection are the Fairchild notebooks. In the 1950s, William Shockley left Bell Labs and went west, to this Wild West, to start a new concept, to pursue the concept of, he was destined to be a Nobel Prize winner, but what would become the semiconductor revolution? He was smart, but he was a terrible manager. He had recruited the best of the best, people from all over the country, and nobody could stand working for him. So one fateful day, his top 8 scientists walked out. Together they made a pact and said, "We are leaving." They had $1 bills, they signed all their names on it, and they said, "Together, this is our new covenant. We are making a new kind of company with more enlightened leadership. We're going to be leading this together, pursuing things in new ways." And with that was a shot heard around the world, the first time that a large company had people that walked out and began a new startup in the technical field. They founded Fairchild Semiconductor, which then led to the integrated circuit. Their impact was just not in creating the spirit of entrepreneurship, but it was in pairing those together. I have here the original notebook of Robert Noyce, one of 1,200 that the museum has, of these people over a 20-year period where they recorded the work that they were doing, the questions that they were having. What would it be like if we could change the substrate? What would it be like if we could get the chemicals to interact in a different way? On page 71, January 23rd, 1959, Bob Noyce writes, what were the essential 4 concepts that led to the integrated circuit? At age 26, he was asking important questions that literally have transformed the world. Estimates now put integrated circuits around the world at a zettabyte, 10 to the 21 power. These people, when they ask the questions, ask important questions, not only why, and what if, but how can we make the difference? We've been the privilege of what we are now collecting in the museum. In a more recent example, are there any Pandora users in the audience? So here, Tam Westergren asked, as a musician, why is it that some of the best musicians, new musicians, can't get their music played on the radio? It was a classic catch-22 chicken and egg question. Of course, you can't get your music put on the radio until you're well known, but how are you going to get well known if nobody can hear you? So he had this concept of what if we could kind of figure out the DNA of music, describe it in a way so that a new listener could have recommended to them music that was actually fit their interest. So he started to hire people to come work in their offices, and they started to listen to music and specifically go through 200 attributes of what that music is. What's its rhythm? What's its melody? They had 25 attributes just for the sound of the music, of the voice alone. Is it raspy? Is it smooth? They started to build this kind of genetic code for every piece of music. So they combined, their idea was, what if we combined the power of search with data? We put those things together so we could make an algorithm that could accurately describe what kind of music would be your fit. And now Pandora has, I think, 85 million active users who are using the music on an average of 25 minutes a day. These stories of people, of entrepreneurs and innovators who are thinking about why, what if, and how are inspiring to me. It's not just because they changed the music that I listen to, but because so many of these technologies and services are fundamentally changing the way that we work, live, and play. For me, these questions began over 20 years ago when I was a student here. I've had the privilege to be patient. These are not easy questions to answer. What enables innovation and entrepreneurship that's disruptive? What enables it to sustain over time? How do communities create and recreate their leading edge? I love this quote. Be patient and try to love the questions themselves. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually live long some distant day into the answer. My invitation to you is to find some questions that are compelling enough to you that you will live with them day by day. That they'll be the kind of questions that you forget about time with, that you feel alive that you're asking, that you can find a community of people to ask those what-if questions. I'd like to now turn to another kind of question. And this is a question, it's not what we know or what we do, but who we are. Yesterday marked the 8th anniversary when I was diagnosed with breast cancer. During that time, I was laid low. For those who've had that experience, sometimes we have those experiences in life when we really can't do much, couldn't do anything. There were times when I was weeks in bed. I would concentrate on one breath to the next. After 4 surgeries, 6 rounds of chemo, 25 rounds of radiation, and a year and a half of hormonal treatment, one of the most important questions that I learned to ask was not what questions should I ask, but whose questions should I be an answer to? I think some of the most, in fact, I think the most important questions are questions not that we ask, but questions that we become an answer to. Who we are, who we fundamentally are, who we've become, and who we are going to become. In the scriptures, of course, we see that God is asking us questions. From the very beginning with Adam and Eve, he asked, where art thou? He knew where they were. He doesn't need information from them. He wants their life to be an answer. Time and again, he calls out and asks us questions. Questions that he desires us to become an answer to. So as I close, I'd like to suggest that these questions that we ask, that we are at this unprecedented opportunity now in this time when we have answers all around us, information, tools, and technologies that allow us to find answers to our questions quickly, an eighth of a second on Google, a typical Google search. Information that ranges across decades, centuries, geographies, like in the search that Carl and Gloria used to find our family. In this time, the questions that we're asked are increasingly important because they focus us on what we're going to be thinking about, how our knowledge is growing, and how we're going to answer those questions of why and what if. As we turn these questions into engines for the intellect, the things that go from inquiry and curiosity to these kind of lifelong pursuits of things that we live with, the questions that we live with, and the answers that we're trying to search to bless people around us in deep and lasting ways. I hope that we'll find those beautiful questions. We'll ask them so that we can live more fully, love more meaningfully, and become an answer to the most important questions of who we are and how we can become better people to bless those around us. Thank you very much.
We actually have a few minutes if any of you dare ask a question after that. So if we have a couple of questions, Marguerite, come on up and...
I'll just say that there's a great Carl Sagan quote, and he says that you can test a person's cleverness on the answers they give, but their wisdom by their questions. So now who wants to ask a question? Seriously. Please.
Does it make any difference if the answers are just yes or no?
Yes. You know, some of the most important questions that we answer in our lives as people and as disciples actually we are asked questions that we are asked to answer yes or no. Sometimes a yes or no answer can signal something very important, a commitment that we've made, or an answer that's beyond black and white. But typically, the most expansive questions that have led to inquiry and exploration are ones that are open-ended. And that, I think, finding the right way to kind of define that net is the art of asking a beautiful question. One of the metaphors I think about is our family was in Sri Lanka earlier this year, and we went out on this long way out into the Indian Ocean, and we were in pursuit of seeing a blue whale. And we were lucky, we actually saw 9 that day. But the thing that I learned about questions that day was that it wasn't just the people that were looking for the blue whales that were out there, it was all the fishermen. The fishermen were there on all these boats, and they were there. They figured out that if they cast their nets just the right way, that if they're with the big fish, all the small fish are there. I think that's an interesting metaphor for thinking about how we ask questions. Sometimes we're thinking about the biggest one, but if we get close to them and we cast our nets in the right way, we can ask and find a lot of value in the smaller fish that will help us on the way. Other questions? How about answers? Taylor?
How do you help people learn how to ask questions and be persistent when so much of our culture tells us to stop asking?
I really like what you said there. So much of our culture does tell us to stop asking. And I think I began by saying that this university has the motto of the glory of God is intelligence, and intelligence comes from asking intelligent questions and seeking for answers. So that's a concern that I have for all of us. I think there's this layer, it's like an onion, that we ask the first question, and like E. Cummings said, there's one beautiful answer, and then we ask the next question that comes. And that sort of relentless pursuit to see yes and then what's the next question is one way. A second is to allow the people who are inquiring to take risks. So often in a classroom, it's safe to ask the question that shows what we already know the answer to. It's very hard to be vulnerable in the way that we ask our questions. So building a culture that celebrates people who can be vulnerable is another important part. And being patient to ask questions that may not have an immediate answer, I think is a third specific strategy. Please.
So some questions, there's no bad question, but certainly there are questions that are better than others. How would you counsel someone to ask the best question, the right question?
That's such a value question, right? It becomes very personal, and the best inquiry is one that becomes like this dance between the questioner and the knowledge, the questioner and the person being questioned. And I think I'm reluctant to prescribe to other people what I think the best questions for them are.
How have you done?
So I have questions that I ask myself every day. And they've changed over time, but they all stem from two fundamental things, which are, given who I believe, who I am, my purpose here, what am I doing to fulfill that purpose? And which for me comes directly from my understanding from Heavenly Father. And secondly, what am I doing to make a difference, to bless people in a lasting way around me? But when we ask the best questions, get translated into minutia. So what's the most important thing for my team at the museum to be doing research on? Or out of all the possible documents, if we're trying to build the museum that's going to have the enduring primary sources that people 100 years from now will want to be able to access, to understand entrepreneurship, what should we collect? Those kind of questions are a lot harder to answer on that high level. So having kind of a framework that drills down has been helpful.
So as you spoke about your experience with cancer, I couldn't help but think of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and he talks about something called logotherapy, and it seems to ring very closely with what you're talking about. You said that to most questions we want an answer. To the most important questions we must be an answer. In his book, he talks about the thing that got him through his experience in the concentration camps was not asking why is this happening to me, but more like what am I supposed to give back to life, or something to that effect. Was that similar to the sort of existential inquiry that you felt when you were going through that hardship?
Absolutely. That experience, for me, it wasn't a productive question, and I don't think it was a valid question to ask, why me? That's what I thought at first. But then I realized that actually why me was the right answer. Is there something that I can learn from this, that I can become transformed? Well, can I be a better person from this experience? I experienced things that were so hard. I had never been pushed to that physical, emotional stretching where there were certain things that only I could experience and do. And yet, on the other side from the bitter was some of the sweetest, extraordinary experiences of compassion, of care, of healing that went far beyond anything physical, and I'm grateful to say that I feel healed physically. So asking those questions where we feel that we are being transformed fundamentally, I think are the questions that help us move forward. If a wise person said, if you have a deep enough understanding of why, you can always get through almost any kind of a how. And that was my experience during that time.
I'm very concerned about the information that is abroad in the United States, that people are less interested in religion. They're not interested in asking the questions of themselves. Who am I, and why am I alive here, and how? Why was I born in the United States, or why was I led to be an immigrant? Why do I have these blessings and other people don't have them? But they're not asking the questions. They're wanting to live in the immediate instant of gratification. And so this is the question I have. What's going to become of our society when we transfer a long-range view and ask questions about long-range views into time and eternity and our purposes of eternity? When they are only interested in momentary, instant gratification and do not want to even consider religious aspects of their purpose in life.
It's a concern of our time, isn't it? And I realize that it's a major concern. I'd like to close by saying I'm optimistic because look around us. Look at the people in this room. The people in this room are asking that question and answering it with their lives in beautiful ways. And as I've had the experience of leaving here however many years ago, several decades ago, and been blessed to have experiences across the country and around the world, I believe deeply that each of us, if we ask these kind of questions, our lives become beautiful, sanctified, powerful, and through the lives of individuals, we can make differences that do span over time and space. And because of that, I'm optimistic about the future. I'm very grateful for the time passed here at BYU. So thank you very much.